Thank you for joining us for Preserving America's Revolutionary War Era Sites, the third webinar of our 2026 Preserve the Past, Build for the Future webinar series. We're recording this session and it will be made available later on our YouTube channel. Also, if you need closed captioning, please click on the Show Captions button. Hi, I'm Lynn Richmond, the ACHP Communications Officer. And joining me today is Ashley Fry, Director of the Office of External Engagement. We're getting ready to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States, and historic sites are physical reminders of that time in history. Preserving these sites is not just about safeguarding battlefields or historic buildings, it's about ensuring that future generations can understand, honor, and learn from the sacrifices and ideals that gave birth to the U.S. Today's webinar will explore ongoing efforts to protect Revolutionary Era sites and discuss the challenges and successes faced by these sites. We've assembled an excellent panel, and we hope this webinar will educate you about this interesting aspect of historic preservation. Just a quick word about the ACHP. The ACHP is an independent federal agency that promotes the preservation of America's historic places and advises the President and Congress on national historic preservation policy. The ACHP is the only federal agency whose sole mission is historic preservation. A large part of the ACHP's work is overseeing Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which requires federal agencies and those receiving federal funding or federal licensure to consider historic preservation when carrying out an undertaking. Find out more about us on our website, and we'll put that link in the chat. We're really excited today about our guests. They are Rebecca Baird, the archivist at the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon in Virginia. Sam Huntington, Historic Site Manager at Crown Point State Historic Site in New York. And Nina Zaneri, the Executive Director of the Paul Revere Memorial Association in Massachusetts. Welcome, everybody. Before we begin, if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat box. Once the speakers have given their presentations, we'll call on you to pose your questions directly to our panelists. Now let's begin with Rebecca Baird.
Thank you, Lynn. Let me share my screen really quick. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in today's panel. My name is Rebecca Baird. I'm the archivist for the Mount Vernon Ladies Association's collection at the George Washington Library at Mount Vernon. Most of you are probably familiar with Mount Vernon, but just in case you're not, it's George Washington's historic home and plantation about 10 miles or so outside of Washington, D.C. Most people think that the federal government or the state of Virginia owns Mount Vernon, but it is in fact privately owned by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And I'm going to be focusing on them and their history and ongoing work today. I know in the preservation community, the Ladies Association story is kind of well known, so apologies if some of this is info you already know, but hopefully I do cover some new things for you today as well. The MPLA, as we typically refer to them here, have owned and operated Mount Vernon since 1860, and they're often referred to as the first National Historic Preservation Organization in the U.S. Their mission has remained the same since its founding years: to preserve, restore, and manage the estate of George Washington to the highest standards, and for it to appear as much as possible as it did during Washington's life. They operate as the executive board of a historic house, but they are unique because of their structure. The board is made up entirely of women, usually around 20 or 30 of them at a time, all from different states. One woman serves as the regent or the head of the association, and the other women are called vice regents. And that structure has been in place since the 1850s. They elect the regent for a 3-year term and nominate new members as women retire out of the board. Because the MPLA does not receive any kind of government funding, one of the key roles served by the board is fundraising and bringing national interest to Mount Vernon, along with making major decisions about infrastructure, finances, restoration, things like that. So that's a brief introduction to the MPLA as a group, but now I'll turn to their incredible history and pioneering efforts in preservation and end with what they've been recently up to. So after George and Martha Washington died, Mount Vernon was inherited by his nephew and then other descendants. Each subsequent owner struggled with maintaining the property to the standards set by George Washington and couldn't make it profitable. Visitors came expecting to see Washington's tomb and where he lived. So even though Mount Vernon was private property owned by the Washington family, people would come to the house, look through the gardens, pay respects at the tomb, and they treated it like it was a public space. So through the decades following Washington's death, the house and grounds suffered from a gradual decline in condition. And by the 1850s, the mansion looked like this. It was in really bad condition. The owner at the time, George Washington's great grandnephew, John Augustine Washington III, wanted to be rid of the property. He tried to sell it to the federal government or the state of Virginia, but neither entity was able to rally enough support or money to buy it. So word had gotten around that he was trying to sell it, and people were worried about what would happen to it, who would buy it. And that's really where the Ladies Association starts. This is Anne Pamela Cunningham, the daughter of a fairly wealthy plantation owner in South Carolina. She was single and an invalid. We don't know the exact cause of her chronic illnesses, but she suffered her whole adult life with an array of symptoms. Her mother had traveled by Mount Vernon and saw the state of it and gave Anne Pamela the idea of having the ladies of the South raise money to purchase it and restore it to its George Washington era condition. And this became Anne Pamela's life's work. She wrote the first article to this effect in the Charleston Mercury newspaper in December 1853. And by early in the next year, she began persuading her friends and network to get involved, and they formed an association of women. Her initial goal was for this venture to remain a Southern women's organization and for the property to pass to the state of Virginia after they raised enough money to buy it. But Northern women quickly also became interested, and Pamela decided that Washington belonged to the whole country, not just the South. So she opened it up to women everywhere, and it became a national organization. In fact, when they became an incorporated body through the Virginia Assembly, a bill that passed in March 1853, their official title was the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union. As women, they could not hold property in their own right, but as an incorporated body, they could do so. They went through many struggles, but the main one being that the owner, John Augustine Washington III, was refusing to sell it to them. So through several years of negotiations and fundraising and spreading the word, they reached an agreement with Mr. Washington and signed a contract with him in April 1858 to purchase Mount Vernon for $200,000. And they would own it outright and keep it in perpetuity. They had 5 years to pay off the entire amount. So the first years as an organization were entirely devoted to fundraising. Miss Cunningham appointed 30 vice-regents in 1858 and 1859. Her goal was to get one from every state, but didn't quite make it. And here are some of them. They were mostly elite white women from all over the country who were well-connected and patriotic and loyal to the Mount Vernon cause. Among them were Alexander Hamilton's granddaughter, a daughter of Francis Scott Key, the wife of the first governor of Minnesota, the wife of a famous sculptor, socialites, authors, and on and on. They did pay off the total early. By December 1859, all but $6,000 of it was paid off. Mount Vernon's Civil War story is also very interesting in and of itself, but I don't really have time to go into that in detail today. But if you are interested in that story, we have some good info on our website, so you can check that out. In the next few decades after the Civil War, the Ladies Association really turned their attention back to restoration and trying to return the buildings and gardens at Mount Vernon back to how they appeared in Washington's time. There was no preservation manual for this at the time, so at first they're just trying to fill the mansion with any furniture and housewares from the colonial period that they can. But a dozen or so years went by and they decided to narrow their scope, realizing that if they wanted it to appear as it did in Washington's time, they had to fill it with Washington's furniture and housewares and personal items as best they could. They also began to try and have the correct paint colors or wall color or wallpapers for each room. Through the years, new sources are discovered, new technologies become available, and we have to keep reevaluating the spaces, not only throughout the mansion, but on the grounds. And today we have a team of archaeologists, architectural historians, people like that who all work to make sure the public sees an authentic Mount Vernon. As time went on, the association became more and more dedicated to authenticity. And here is a really good visual example of that. In this slide, you see you see on the left-hand side, that's the east front of the mansion facing the Potomac River. And in the photo, you see two really prominent features, the balustrade along the top of the roof of the piazza or the portico, and then also the south porch on the side of the mansion there. Both of these were discovered to be additions to the house after George Washington's time. So despite them both being popular exterior features, they were removed in the 1930s, as you can see in the photo on the right, for authenticity purposes. And it was a controversial decision at the time. One other really important pioneering effort I wanted to quickly tell you about before moving into more recent efforts. I'm jumping ahead to the 1950s. If you've ever visited Mount Vernon, you might remember this beautiful view from the mansion looking over the Potomac River across to the shore of Maryland State on the other side. Well, in the 1950s, the Ladies Association heard about plans to commercially develop this land in Mount Vernon's viewshed. The first rumors were for an oil tank farm, then a housing development, then a sewage plant, and on and on. The association knew that this view was essential to their mission. Mount Vernon could not have an authentic 18th century Washington experience if a modern sewage plant was right across the river. So beginning in the 1950s and 60s, the vice regents began their decades-long struggle working with other organizations to preserve this stretch of shoreline. This woman, Frances Bolton, who served in the U.S. House of Representatives for the state of Ohio and as the MVLA's vice regent for Ohio, purchased around 500 acres of land with her own money that she planned to turn over to the federal government as national park land. She also was instrumental in passing legislation to not only create Piscataway Park, but also to put funding in the federal budget for the purchase of more federal land. So much of what you can see of the view now is federally preserved national park property. Mrs. Bolton, the Ladies Association, and other local and federal organizations have also worked with the state of Maryland to give tax credits to those who own land in our viewshed if they place conservation easements on their land. The MVLA has also purchased plots of land, placed use restrictions on them, and then resold them. And all of these efforts are still ongoing. As recent as 2018, the Ladies Association had to campaign against commercial development in this area. One major focus of the MVLA over the last 20 or 30 years is expanding our knowledge and interpretation of the enslaved community at Mount Vernon. Anne Pamela Cunningham and the early vice regents made the decision to keep all of the estate's outbuildings or support buildings like the spinning house, the salt house, and the storehouse, places where the Washington family's enslaved people would have worked and labored. Many of these types of structures were torn down at other colonial era plantations, so we benefit from being able to talk about the lives of the enslaved through the actual buildings that they used. And then we've also reconstructed other buildings that didn't survive, such as slave quarters and a slave cabin, so that we can accurately portray their lives. We know the location near Washington's tomb where many enslaved were buried, and there was a memorial erected there in the early 1980s. But more importantly, within the last 15 years or so, our archaeology department began an ongoing survey of this location to document the exact placement of graves and to create a map of the interred. And lastly, using meticulous records kept by Washington and others at Mount Vernon, we've created a database of enslaved individuals that includes everything we know about them, from which farm they worked on to their physical characteristics. And to end, I wanted to very briefly touch on the current preservation work being done at Mount Vernon that will be completed this year in time for the 250th celebrations. Throughout the last 160 years that the MVLA's owned Mount Vernon, there's been thousands of repairs and restoration projects on the mansion. All of these efforts made the mansion and all of our historic buildings last this long, but they were kind of a patchwork of repairs meant to fix one or two things without looking cohesively at the entire mansion together. How one repair could have an effect on something else. And after surveys and examinations by engineering firms, it was determined that a complete restabilization of the mansion was necessary to do three things: replace an aging HVAC system that will help with moisture and climate control, address drainage and water leakage in the cellar, which has been a problem since Washington's time, and to replace 19th and 20th century framing repairs with traditional 18th century features and methods that bring the mansion back to its original structural design. Some of the things they've done, like this image that you see here, they've used cantilever, steel beam cantilever shoring that basically held the mansion in place while work was done on the foundation and in the cellar. These types of things are only possible with modern machinery and technology. And the benefits at the end of this will be an HVAC system that is hidden in a bunker so it doesn't disturb the authentic experience of the house, a restored cellar that will look as it did in Washington's time for the first time in over 200 years. And the mansion will hopefully be stable enough to last for centuries more, which is the entire mission of the Ladies Association. So that's my presentation. So thanks everybody for listening. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so the next presenter can come on.
Thank you, Rebecca.
You're
That was fascinating. I already have some questions, and I'm sure that our viewers will also have some great questions when it comes time. So, people, I just want to remind you to put your questions in the chat so we can know to call on you. Our next presenter is Sam Huntington.
Well, yeah, I'm Sam Huntington. I work at Crown Point State Historic Site. I'm the historic site manager here. This is a view of Lake Champlain from the banks of what we call the British Fort. I think Crown Point is probably slightly less known than Mount Vernon. So I was going to start with a little history of the site itself and then talk about some of the restoration efforts that are really ongoing at Crown Point. The site itself, we manage about 380 acres of land. The historic grounds that we manage as part of the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation were home to two 18th century fortifications. One, a relatively small French fort that you can see the perimeter outline of that close to the bridge, and then a much larger British fort, which was constructed after the French fort. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that all unfolded. This is an aerial view of pretty much the shoreline of Lake Champlain, and you can see the outlines of the two fortifications from this shot. The Lake Champlain Bridge is also historic. The original one was built in 1929, was torn down in 2009, and then replaced in 2011. This is one of the only crossings of Lake Champlain for nearly 100 miles. The settlement at Crown Point began with a French fortification. You see an illustration of that on the right and a model of it on your left. The French fort at Crown Point was built beginning in 1734 and was served a variety of purposes. One was really to monitor traffic on kind of a choke point in Lake Champlain, a narrow passing, but also to anchor settlement of French and typically second generation French Canadian settlers in the Champlain Valley. The French occupation ended in 1759 during the French and Indian or 7 Years' War. The French basically were consolidating their forces in Montreal and Quebec and blew up their fortifications in the Champlain Valley, and that's what we have a rendering of here on the screen. Subsequent to the British or the French evacuation in 1759, a British army that had been making its way up into the Champlain Valley came to the peninsula and began fortifying the spot, which for a long time had been the goal of the British and American colonists to the south, which was essentially to take Crown Point and get a foothold on Lake Champlain. So construction of the British fortification began in 1759. What you see in these images are on the left, the green sort of landscape picture is another drone photograph of what we have today. The ruins of the British fort. These were large log walls that were backfilled with dirt, and essentially it's built in a typical star fort pattern that you see in the 18th century. This particular fort encloses approximately 7 acres of land, and at the time it was one of the largest fortifications in North America when the British began construction in 1759. The fort was never fully completed. The British basically began construction, as I said, when they arrived in 1759, which included an army that was destined for Canada eventually, and they had about between 10 and 12,000 soldiers on the peninsula. So they built a rather large fortification in anticipation of the possibility that the French might come back and try to retake Crown Point. That, of course, never happened. The war ended in 1763, a long way from Crown Point, and they basically stopped building what they planned in that year. And subsequent to that, between the years of 1763 and 1773, this really large fort that was never finished functioned largely as a kind of administrative post, monitoring traffic on the lake and doing other sorts of things in the interwar period. That was until 1773, when a fire in one of the barracks structures began as a chimney fire. There was a soldier's wife who was cooking a midday meal. The chimney caught fire. It spread to the roof tiles, which were all wooden, and then burned through both barrack structures, and eventually caught the perimeter walls, which were all log walls of the fort itself, on fire, resulting in basically what one engineer called a heaping mass of useless earth. As the log walls burned away, the dirt that had backfilled them remained, and that's why we have what we have today, which is a perfect outline of the original British fort in basically these tall, steep, grassy banks. In the American Revolution, this existing fortification had been sort of through the 1773 fire, and there was a small contingent of only about 9 soldiers who remained at Crown Point to basically continue their administrative work in this post on Lake Champlain. And at the outset of the American Revolution, a group under Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen began very early on in the first few weeks of the Revolution capturing posts along Lake Champlain. That included a small town called Skeensboro, Fort Ticonderoga, and then the day after Fort Ticonderoga, Crown Point. During the Revolution, it was used as a post, but also I included this outline of the fortification itself. It's a LiDAR map where you can see behind some of the barrack structures, there's these pits and holes. We're confident those that still show up in the landscape today were used by the Americans. They excavated cannon, some of which went to Boston to help push the British out of Boston. Throughout the 19th century, it became one of many tourist attractions in the Lake Champlain Valley. This is of a centennial event, or possibly the bicentennial, or excuse me, the tricentennial of Samuel D. Champlain's voyage down the lake in 1909. The ruins survived well into the 20th century, and originally next became part of the state of New York, took ownership of the lands in 1910 with a focus really on preserving what was there. And over the course of the early 20th century, the entire peninsula essentially became a place for preservation and recreation. They built a campground during the 1920s and 1930s across the road. Once the bridge was built, it became a popular travel destination. And that's essentially what the site became in the early 20th century. Looking backward now from the 21st century, our current approach to operations in Crown Point is kind of multifaceted. Our primary goal is, of course, the public interpretation of the site and with its historic preservation. On the historic preservation front, that really means two primary things that we focus on, including, masonry stabilization, restoration, and preservation, and the protection of the archaeological resources under the surface, and preserving historic view sheds. So I'll start with the historic masonry. These images are basically, depicting things that we use pretty regularly in the restoration efforts. Crown Point has a mason on staff. There has been one here since the 1970s, and in that time, there's really only been 3 who have had the title of Mason at Crown Point as the primary person who leads the restoration efforts. But typically, when a section of wall needs to be repaired, those masons identify it, we photograph it, the stones are numbered, removed from the wall if that's necessary, chipped out, and then relaid based on the photograph. So the stones that are laid up in these walls of old barrack structures are essentially the same ones in almost every case as what was there when the site entered state ownership in 1910. What you see in the image on the left is how this work gets done, is that it can't stop for the weather. So and the image on the left is what is affectionately known as the shack by the masons. This winter shelter is basically pipe scaffolding wrapped in insulation, plywood, and then they add heaters and are able to relay sections of masonry during the wintertime. The picture on the right is also part of our kind of rock salvage effort, includes identifying and separating stones that we know were used in the British fort versus ones that we know might have been used in the French fort. The stone on the right-hand side has a sort of chiseled edge around the outside. It looks almost like a saw pattern, and then a dimpled face. These are typical of French North American masonry. You find them at other French forts in the area. Some of the French stones in the French fort were actually shipped in from a quarry on the northern end of Lake Champlain, and some of them around doorways and other locations were decorated in this particular motif. So as we find those stones, either for restoration work or even just in other places on site where they may have been deposited by the explosion when the French evacuated, they go into the Mason's rock pile so they can be recycled and reused as necessary, or looked at and studied by other people who are interested in French Canadian masonry. One of the things that the Masons and really all aspects of site operations deal with is trying to remedy some of the previous remedies of the 20th century. The image on the left is our current mason up in the lift with a contractor who are actually design professionals in historic preservation who are examining a pretty bowed out, bulging wall, and they're dropping a plumb bob to see how far out it is. Significant sections of the barrack structures were restored in the 20th century using the best methods known to them, which often focused on trying to consolidate and find permanent solutions. So in some cases, we have heavy steel cabling, which hasn't allowed the building to move where it needs to in some cases. In other circumstances, you see, like in the image on the right, a lot of parge coating that was laid up on top of stonework. And in the 20th century, this was deemed a possible permanent and effective fix, but it's often very harder than the original masonry and traps moisture inside the walls, causing more damage than preventing future damage. Beyond the historic masonry, what you see in this image, we've seen this before, is wide open fields, a lot of steep rocky surfaces, all of which get cut at least once a year. Typically, this is work done with a tractor, lawnmowers, but in many cases, a team of seasonal staff and permanent staff will go out and do it all by hand with weed whackers. On a typical day at Crown Point, you can see at least 4 people, usually buzzing away on some steep bank that can't be cut with particular machinery. So we do it with staff and their weed whackers. This is done really to preserve archaeological resources under the surface by cutting the grounds and preventing deep-rooted vegetation like trees from taking root. We're able to basically preserve the foundations of structures, the forts themselves, and other outbuildings that are associated with the 18th century occupation of the peninsula. In this same instance, we're also sort of dealing with some of the errors or mistakes of the 20th century, and that includes what you see in this picture is a 1968 aerial photo of the French fort, when you can probably just make out the bulldozers and dump trucks when they were excavating around the foundations of the building using those methods, which are obviously not what we would do today. Unfortunately, when those excavations were taking place in the 1960s, the dirt was saved, and only in the past few years have we developed a partnership with Syracuse University to kind of go through the back dirt and dump site where a lot of that dirt was removed, and we're doing an annual field school with Syracuse here at Crown Point to sort of deal with that previously disturbed and relocated soil. The final thing is we talk about our preservation efforts all the time. We have staff who give regular guided tours, and baked into that is a discussion of why the grounds look the way they do, how sensitive the archaeological resource is, and also the nature of the masonry work that goes on day in and day out, year round. I sometimes joke that even though we have paid interpretive staff, our masons probably talk to more people than we do because they get questions as they're working and are really the best subjects or best candidates to answer the questions. So I hope there's lots of questions or inquiries about whether it's how we interpret the grounds, how we deal with the archaeological resource or the masonry. But I think I'm just about out of time, so I'll leave it there.
Sam. Yeah, I definitely have questions, more questions. So I welcome questions. Of course, once everybody has given their presentations, you can just, do the little hand raise reaction and I'll call on you, or you can just drop your question in the chat so I'll know you want to speak. But again, thank you both to Rebecca and Sam. And now up next is Nina Zaneri from the Paul Revere Memorial Association. Nina.
I am the executive director of the Paul Revere Memorial Association in Boston, and I am struck by the fact that as an urban location, we have a lot of challenges and issues that are somewhat different from the other sites you have heard from. As you can see, we are connected to buildings all over the place. We own 3 buildings. You can see the corner of the Paul Revere House and our handicapped access that comes over and touches the building. The building that's directly behind us is an 1835 building that used to be Paul Revere's backyard. There was an owner of the house who decided to sell off the backyard and create a set of 2 families. And then on this other corner, you can see the corner of another building that we own. So we have a very small footprint, and we have very small buildings. And that creates certainly some interesting issues. Again, as you can see here, the Revere House, built in 1680, which is the best known and the most visited. And you see a building, you can see that we're redoing the roof, which we recently did to solve some serious leak issues. And as we were working on that roof, or beginning to, one of the contractors got nervous about the structural integrity. And we went through an engineering study. We took a look, and our wonderful architect came up with a lovely monitoring system that we have in the attic, so that when the guys were climbing around on the roof, we could manage and monitor whether there was any movement. So that was a great comfort to us. On the far left, you see the Pierce Hitchborn House, which is 1711. It's a brick building, so we have to deal with masonry issues on that building. And you can see that we have our window washers are working away one day. So there's the type of work we do that's as complicated as a roof job, and then the regular things like just making sure that the windows are washed. In the middle, you see a building that was on Revere's back property, built in 1835 as a two-family. We acquired it in 2007 and restored it and converted it into a visitor center for the Paul Revere House, which has been, and it also allowed us to do the handicap access, which was really important. We face a lot of challenges. We are a deeply imperfect restoration. The Paul Revere House, lived in by Paul Revere from 1770 to 1800. It then moved through a series of residents. Shops were added on the ground floor. It became a boarding house for local sailors and then an immigrant tenement. And so it was heavily used. The irony is that great amount of use actually meant that the house was still economically viable. And so it actually didn't get torn down as so many historic buildings did in Boston. There were a lot of prominent historic buildings that, for one reason or another, just were not saved. The Revere House was saved, but it also was dramatically altered by this use pattern over time. And so the house was a little bit threatened. There was a fire in the house in 1901 that raised some concern, and a family member, John Phillips Reynolds, a Revere descendant, stepped up in 1902 and bought the house and started the preservation effort. It was about $30,000 to restore it. We wish anything costs $30,000 now. And the problem is, if you look on the left, you see a full three-story building. If you look at the restored house, it has a pitched roof. It is still the same height, but it's only 2.5 stories because it's been altered. So the house was restored to reflect its 17th century time period. And the thought was that the exterior would be the 17th century and the interior would reflect Paul Revere. We also believe that for the family and for people at the time, it was hard for them to believe that what had become a very damaged immigrant tenement building was actually what Revere would have recognized. They were a little more comforted by something that seemed to be a more dramatic change. So this creates what I call the sort of the Paul Revere and pasta approach. We have made the decision that the house, its interior, certainly will reflect to the extent that we know. There are very few records as to what the house was like when Paul Revere lived there. So we really are having to create representative interiors. So the inside, 3 of the rooms reflect Paul Revere's time, and 1 reflects the first owner, Robert Howard, who was a wealthy merchant. But we also look at the house over time in the community. And that's why I say Paul Revere and pasta, because the North End became an immigrant community and then became a fairly heavily Italian community and remains Boston's Little Italy, although it has been gentrified most recently. So for us, because we are so much in the community of the North End, we have to really think about whether or not we are a good and valued part of our community. And I think that is something that sets urban sites apart. You really do have to make sure that you are both a good resident of your community, that you are doing things in the community that are of value. We are free to North End residents. We participate in community activities, sometimes against our own interests. In fact, we had an opportunity to bring tour buses into the North End, and it's really not a good thing for the North End. The streets are so narrow. So we have always rejected having tour buses come all the way in and drop people right in front of our property. We also deal with beautification efforts in the North End, and when there are issues that come up, we try to be supportive of the North End. I will say that worked out very well for us. When we bought the building at the back in 2007, the only use that was restricted by zoning was museum. Well, you might say, well, Nina, why did you buy a building that was restricted use as a museum? We were able to work with the community, and because we had been a good member of the community, they supported our using it for a visitor center. We just didn't call it a museum. A couple of the challenges that I want to talk about are more generic. We have been thinking a lot about the impact of climate change. We have developed a climate action plan. We are currently working with an engineering firm on a risk assessment. We are near the harbor, so there are issues with sea level rise, groundwater. I know there was some mention about wet basements already. We have water in 2 of our basements. We have active sump pumps that we use on a regular basis. So there are issues with groundwater. There's also stormwater. In urban locations, there's a lot of concern about rising temperatures, heat islands that created in the north end. We have gardens and some trees on our property to try to mitigate that. Heavier than normal rainfall, wind, and also colder than usual temperatures. And so I recommend people be thinking about climate change and how that might affect their properties. There's also the cost of preservation. We have, over the years, built both a reserve fund and an endowment so that when things come up, we don't have to wait to raise the money. The real problem with raising funds for preservation is the timing of them. And so often, if you have something that really needs to be done, you may not have the time to do fundraising to go out. And if you do wait to raise the money for the project, sometimes the cost will, not sometimes, always the cost will go up, and the problems can fester and get worse. So having reserves that you can use when a problem pops up is really important. The other issue is the sort of economy and tourism. Properties like ours, I would argue this is true of my colleagues' sites as well. We are involved in the sort of tourism. Tourism is a big part of how we get visitors to our property. We have right now around 270,000 visitors a year, which is a lot for a very small footprint. We have been up around 320,000. That's great. It drives a lot of revenue, which is very important. But there are pros and cons to being an economic engine and driven by tourism. There's the wear and tear on the property. We think a lot about, are we just bringing too many people into the house? Should we be having fewer people come into the house? And the opposite of that is when you are an economic engine, sometimes you can use that to argue for funds. We've found that when we are dealing with the state or the city on grants, they often want to know, what are we giving back to the community? What are we giving back to the state? And talking about school programs and other things we do is great, but there's a point where they really do want to see an economic equation. And I think that's a challenge for those of us who love what we do and care about the preservation. We want it to be valued just because, but a lot of times we do have to make the economic argument. For the Paul Revere House, the other challenge has been that for many years we were just viewed as a tourist trap. We were a deeply flawed restoration, and we were putting a lot of people through, and so we decided to make a lot of effort to be viewed as a serious public history organization. We fund a research fellowship annually. We do a lot of our own publishing. And so we've tried to balance that. And my point is that you have a lot of different things that you will be trying to balance. Economic engine, tourism, cost of preservation, climate change, research, and how you do that in a smaller organization. We have 7 full-time staff. We're not really a big place, even though we have high attendance. So as you can see, I'm very practical, and so I thought I would share with you some of my rules of the road. This is how you keep your buildings standing. You really do have to know your buildings, as I call them, your quirks and your charms. Nobody wants to learn about HVAC systems, plumbing, or security systems, but if you are the chief facilities person, as I am at my place, in addition to the chief fundraiser and the CEO, you better know those buildings. We just had a sewage ejector contractor here, and I was in there talking to him about that. These are not the glamorous things, but the HVAC systems and the security systems and the sump pumps and all the things that keep your buildings standing and allow you to then do all of the interpretation and all of the sharing and all the school programs. Using trusted contractors, we do not always go with a low bid. We often will go with a high bid because we have contractors who we trust. They are the contractors who you want to answer the phone in the middle of the night when you get a call that the power has gone off in one of your buildings. And we had that this winter. The Hitchborn House, our main electrical system fried. We came into the building and it was cold and dark. And so we had the challenge of how did we keep pipes from bursting and other things. And so you really do have to keep those things in mind. Develop specific emergency plans for each of your buildings. Are there things that people need to know? Make sure that you've got your fire department going through regularly and looking at things. You want them to love your buildings. We do monitor our buildings on a regular basis. I mentioned the system that we put in the attic of the Revere House to monitor any flexing of that structure. We also monitor relative heat and humidity. We also have what we call water that you know and water that you don't know. Is there suddenly something damp that wasn't damp before? And how do you respond to that and how do you deal with that? The other one is not to cut corners. You really have to make sure that you have all the right contractors in place every time you're working on a building. We had an instance where if we had not had the right contractor, we would have had a real disaster. And so it's really about knowing who needs to be in the room, when do you need to bring in an engineer, when do you need to bring your architect back in, and all of those things that are so important to keeping these buildings. Now, I decided to give you a nasty picture. What is this, you might ask? Well, this is the basement of the Paul Revere House, where we obviously store some things. We also have our heating system down there. This is sewage. This is sewage bubbling up through a floor drain into the basement of the Paul Revere House. Now, what's interesting is we don't have any bathrooms or sinks in the Paul Revere House. There's almost no water. This was a backup from the main sewer line in the street, and it was being plugged by something that you may or may not have heard of, which is called a fatberg. What is a fatberg? A fatberg is what happens when local restaurants run their grease into the sewer lines, and it collects all kinds of wonderful things that are in the sewer lines, and it blocks the line. And so we had to get Boston Water and Sewer come in and drain the line, and once that happened, we had to sanitize the basement. We had ServPro come in. They came in twice, cleaned up and sanitized the basement so that we could reopen. As I have said, urban locations are really, really challenging. We have a part of a highway tunnel that runs in under the Hitchborn House and creates issues for us. The old State House in Boston has a subway system under it. Um, Urban locations create chaos that you do not control. Contractors don't like to come into the city. They have no place to park. It's hard to get permits. So there are a lot of challenges in an urban location that you really have to be aware of if you're going to run one of these places. My final thoughts are about remembering to say thank you. We always thank our donors, but do we thank our contractors? When we have openings, we invite our contractors, the people, not just the people who worked on the exhibits, but the people who actually keep our electric systems going and our HVAC system going. And every contractor who comes to the site and is lovely and does something wonderful, they leave with free passes. And I will tell you, those contractors come back. So I know I didn't have a lot of pretty images, but I hope I've shared some information that will be useful to you.
Thanks, Nina, for as Michelle Pryor's just said in the chat, thanks for keeping it real. Because those are problems that every historic site probably faces. So if every one of our, thank you, Nina, for that wonderful presentation. Sam and Rebecca, if you could come back on screen, we have some, let's get right to the questions. We do have a couple of anonymous questions that I wanted to just pose to you. And I'm not sure if I'm going to say this word right, but it looks like it's posed to all of you. Are you using photogrammetry and geophysical instruments at these sites to aid in their interpretation and restoration? Anybody?
I'm gonna try. We have done a couple things. We've used some ground penetrating radar to sort of look at our open courtyard space. We also have done some infrared imagery of our properties to get a sense of where we have air and things leaking out of the buildings. I don't know if that completely answers your question. The company that does our surveying also does this infrared photography, and it's really interesting. It sometimes tells you things you can't fix, but I don't know if that completely answers your question.
Sam or Rebecca?
Yeah, we we actually just last week began a project where we're doing basically a 3D scanning of one of the barracks structures, well, both barrack structures in the British fort. So that's essentially, a series of images that'll get stitched together. So you can do pretty much what you can do on Street View and Google Maps. So that's essentially what the photogrammetry kind of extent to which we do that. As far as geophysical instruments, we've talked about them, in the past. Crack monitoring was something that we were pretty diligent about, but the buildings move. Some of the biggest crack monitors you can buy for like an opening in the masonry aren't big enough to cover some of the cracks we have. So I really wanted to just acknowledge Nina, the comment about climate change, and we have exposed masonry ruins, in a upstate New York, Lake Champlain environment where, we're constantly dealing with, observable changes in the freeze thaw cycle. Decades and 50 years ago, we saw a deep freeze followed by, a warm up, and that was that. Now we see cyclical freeze thaw at the shoulder ends of the winter, through December, sometimes even into January. So the cracks sometimes are getting bigger. The pace of the decay is increasing as a result of more frequent freeze thaw cycles. So the old crack monitoring system really hasn't worked, where the things sort of spread apart and you just measure. So we did talk about using geophysical instruments, about putting something that's comparable to like a robotic base station, or at least a recording data logger, at one fixed location, and then have laser points that you can actually pin to the face of the building, and it periodically will measure distance. We haven't installed anything like that, but we've also talked about using that for erosion monitoring, because we are on Lake Champlain and there are concerns about changing, the landscape, historic and just environmental concerns.
We have used photogrammetry and geophysical location technology at Mount Vernon. Also, we use photogrammetry a lot in our current mansion revitalization and restabilization efforts. They've done it. They've gone in. They're using a system called ACHP, which is an architectural kind of software where they go in and use photogrammetry to like basically recreate the entire mansion. Like a 3D version of it. And then we've also used geophysical location, like ground penetrating radar for our archaeology team, especially with use at the slave cemetery.
All right, thank you. We have another anonymous attendee asking a question, and then we'll get to some of the other questions. It says Crown Point, but I think this can be asked for all of you. Is there any idea to use technology like augmented or virtual reality to reconstruct buildings virtually for interpretation purposes? I know that there are some sites like in Virginia that do use virtual reality to show you what it would have looked like since they don't have buildings. Is that the case for any of you using virtual reality to help tell your stories?
We've talked about it and hope to. We have two 18th century fortifications that are ruins of fortifications. So, to be able to stand in the same space and hold up your cell phone and see an image, or something like that would be incredibly useful. The hope to do something like this goes back to before there was augmented reality. One of the old exhibits actually had a plexiglass panel that you could slide up based on your height to line up next to a window that had a line drawing of the French fort. So essentially you'd look through the glass and it would recreate in the exact location. That's something that would be something we'd like to do, with current technology instead of just layering plexiglass. Yeah, we hope to. We haven't done anything with it yet.
I'll say we just started kind of experimenting with virtual reality or augmented reality. They're kind of like first attempt projects that are still kind of ongoing. So there might be more of that in the future, but we're kind of just dabbling in it right now.
We've talked a little bit about trying to do something would be what would you see out the windows of the Revere House? Because when you're in an urban location like we are, you've got time, buildings from all different time periods, and it's very hard for people to sort of understand what the landscape looked like. What would Revere have seen when he looked out his window? And so we have talked to a couple companies about that. Again, the challenge for us is for us, every time we try to create a reality, we want to make sure we're not creating a new a new incorrect reality versus creating an imagery where you can say, okay, we feel pretty comfortable that that's what it would have looked like at the time. So I think it's really challenging, and there is this tension, I think, between people wanting real experiences and wanting, again, not to be as tied into virtual things. There was a time period when that was all the rage. So it's always that challenge of what your visitors are looking for.
Thank you. Kelly Calhoun, do you want to ask your question? I'm allowing you to talk. Did I get you, Kelly? Are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, hi. Wow, this is wonderful. Y'all, your presentations have been so great. I joined a little late because I had my own thing in Georgia to present, but I did not want to miss this. We know when we're talking about the maintenance of buildings and things go wrong, and Nina, you were saying it's nice to know you can call someone in the at midnight. It begs the question, what about your your local government utility and agencies, do they give you preference because of your significance? Like if you call and you're like, hey, we've got a big problem. Have you noticed a little giddy up, or is that something that you hope to, have a little bit more of?
I will say it's either surprisingly good or horrifyingly bad. We have had instances where the city has, no pun intended, ridden to the rescue in a very quickly. I will say that when we lost our power for the Hitchborn house, and it was during that really brutal cold in February, so we were really concerned. Um, the utility brought us a generator. They hooked us up to a generator. They said, we will not leave you until we have a generator hooked up. We have had instances, though, with, say, Boston Water and Sewer, where they didn't care one bit that it was the Paul Revere house. So we've seen both instances, which is why we know if we have contractors who we're paying and they are loyal to us, they will help us. And we don't keep contractors who don't respond.
Sam or Rebecca?
So we're a little different just because we're a New York State facility. So, when we have problems, we have people, we can call out of the regional headquarters and come out and give us a hand. I haven't noticed any difference, but, with public utilities, but, you've never been to Crown Point, I'd encourage you to come visit. There's not a terribly big place. So chances are pretty good that we call somebody and you know who that person is. So having a kind of small local network, I called the phone company recently and my nephew showed up and I was like, oh yeah, you work for them now. I just learned that. So it's if any preference is just more to the small town feel than anything specific to the historic significance.
Yeah.
I think that Mount Vernon is pretty different too. We're a very big location. We're almost like a small city. We have about 500 employees total, including part-time people, all different kinds of staff. We have a maintenance department, and so we have, if things break or fix around our estate, we have our own operations and maintenance people. Some of them even live on site. So yeah, I think that we're pretty fortunate and pretty special that way. Very different than a lot of other places. So, but as far as people responding to our needs, I think we have pretty standard contractors that we work with, and they're pretty much always going to be on call for us.
All right, thank you. Our next question will come from Michelle Pryor. Michelle, are you unmuted?
I can unmute.
Yes,
Thank you so
great.
much. Thank you everyone for your presentations. Nina, as a Boston Metro native, I especially can understand your challenges. Parking alone in the North End is daunting. So thanks for doing great work to all of you. But my question is, do you ever interact with or collaborate with fellow historic sites from the same time period, either in your local area, nationally, or abroad? I imagine with America 250, maybe this is something you've done specially, or perhaps you've collaborated with each other. This is the first time. These are different chapters in the same story, and curious about that. Thanks.
We are along the Freedom Trail, which means that we have a built-in cohort of other historic sites. We're the only house museum that's open on the Freedom Trail. But we have Old North Church, the Old State House, Old South Meeting House, and we work fairly actively together. We also have a relationship with the National Park Service. And then we have regional partners, all of the sites in Lexington and Concord we have relationships with. And this last year when we did the 250th of the Midnight Ride, we had collaborations in Boston, the Coast Guard guys did the rowing for us. We had the city did a drone show. We had the urban parks along the waterfront. We had the folks in Charlestown who did programming. So we had Old North Church. We had, 10 or 15 partners around what was our biggest 250 reenactment. So we love it. We've done some fun collaborations with the Institute of Contemporary Art because we like to show up in places where people won't expect us. So I think collaboration both around the sort of history piece, but also with the other cultural organizations in the city, whether they're art or science or children's museums.
Sam and Rebecca?
I will say so many partners, partners on everything that you can think of. We partner with the Museum of the American Revolution. We partner with our local museums. We partner with other presidential sites. We have our viewshed partners that we work with to protect the viewshed. That's in Maryland, Virginia, district, federal government. We've definitely partnered with Virginia 250 for the 250th. We also partner often with a group called the League of the Descendants of the Enslaved at Mount Vernon, which is a descendant community for the past enslaved individuals. We do lots of projects with them. Yeah, I mean, it can just go on and on. There's tons of them.
Yeah, the same at Crown Point. It's just a long list of partners and collaborators that I won't really run down all of them. But some of these things, just in terms of the way they get set up, some of it's just you're in the same place at the same time. You're looking at the same history. And for us, we're 12 miles up the lake from Fort Ticonderoga, and we attend their events. They love Crown Point. We love Fort Ti. So we're all in that kind of together. So we attend each other's events and get to know each other and have conversations and collaborate. So sometimes it's just a local connection. In other cases, it's just supporting other people's work. So there's a historical society in England because there's a Crown Point in England named after this place. Somebody who was here during the 1750s went back and named his estate Crown Point, and they're doing some things for the 250th this year, and they got my number. So we end up kind of saying, well, we can send information. Let me know how you can help. I haven't probably won't get approval to do a field trip to England, but there's hope. But no, it's one of the biggest things for anybody who's maybe entering the field or is curious. We work very closely with destination marketing organizations and TPAs, tourism promotion agencies in our area. And sometimes it's them coming to us, and sometimes it's us going to them. One of the biggest events or occasions that we've had at Crown Point in my time here was not a historic event. It was because we were a great viewing location for the 2024 solar eclipse. So if you go on, look for pictures of Crown Point, you're going to see great eclipse shots. And we had people parked outside our gate at 4:30 in the morning when we rolled in. So that was spearheaded and led and organized and supported by one of those organizations. Roost, the Regional Office of Sustainable Tourism, was one of our best and most reliable partners. We're in the Champlain Valley National Heritage Area, which is the National Park Service. We're a quarter mile or so from Vermont, and there's a Vermont State Historic Site on the other side of the bridge. So we collaborate with them a lot too. So local, interstate, and international, all of it, I always have learned anyway that the better partner you are, the more and better partners you end up, working with and developing. So.
Thanks. We're getting down to, I think, might be our last question before we close out. But Kelly had a follow-up question. Can you utilize historic tax credits on your sites?
We're a state site, so those aren't for us.
We are a nonpartisan nonprofit organization, so we do get some tax credits through the state of Virginia.
We looked at it when we were restoring the building at the back for our visitor center, but the cost of pursuing it didn't make it a good fit for us. But certainly there are opportunities to look at that. I think the larger the project, the more bang you get for your buck, and our project was not really big enough.
Well, maybe we do have a couple more minutes that we could just squeeze this in. I know that Nina, you mentioned, you talked about the challenges of having visitors come to your site. So how do you, Sam and Rebecca, how do you balance preservation versus the great interest in visiting your sites?
I'll just say it's a constant battle. One that you have to think about and manage consistently. And it does come in waves. I mean, there's always years that are, have more visitation than others. But I mean, our mansion gets around 1 million visitors every year, and that mansion was not made for 1 million visitors every year, which is why we're in the state that we are now, having to go back and restabilize it. I would just say it's just constant effort, constant work. Always something needs to be maintained, needs to be fixed, needs to be repaired. Just constant vigilance, making sure every day that it's gonna be safe, it's gonna be secure and preserved, and it can manage the people for today. And then tomorrow, you worry about tomorrow.
Yeah, for us, it's similar, kind of monitoring and evaluating, various things. We have trails, we have paths that they show damage, they show wear and tear, when they're either being misused or overused. The structures themselves that we have on site, we have a small museum in addition to, the ruins of the fortifications. Those usually, they've survived pretty much the worst things that can happen to them, explosions, fire, all that kind of stuff. So we're left with ruins. So, our biggest challenges with that type of a thing actually have more to do with, the possibility of archaeological, theft, people digging holes, using metal detectors. Again, I talked about this in my presentation. I feel like the best work we can do is the public interpretation. We want people to see that there's a proper way, to do the archaeological, work that needs to get done. And, a lot of our grounds are open and could be susceptible to that. The best things I think we have in our, toolkit are, constant, monitoring, paying attention. We have enough staff to get out on the ground. So I encourage them, get out. If you've got downtime, go where the visitors are, go where the people are. And that's highly useful just to have extra eyes for anything where there might be a problem in an area of archaeological sensitivity. The other thing, besides just the eyes and kind of the monitoring, is the staff that actually do the groundskeeping, are kind of doing a bit of that as well. And the public interpretation, just reminding people that this is protected. They're going to get in trouble, and they're also going to ruin any sort of value associated with an artifact by taking it. And we have a lot of poison ivy, so that helps too. So,
all right. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists again, Rebecca Baird, Sam Huntington, and Nina Zaneri, and also to all of you for joining us today. And thank you to Ashley Fry. The recording of this and all of our Preserve the Past, Build for the Future webinars are posted on our YouTube channel, or you can go to our website. We'll put that in the chat. Also, don't forget to register for our final webinar in May, Preserving America for the Next Generation, involving young people in preservation. You can find the registration link at the link just shared in the chat. Also, please take a moment to fill out the survey that will pop up when you exit the webinar. We use this information to improve our series each year. And be sure to follow the ACHP on all our social media channels and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great day.